Hello, I'm Aaliyah, a partition enthusiast, an in-progress scholar, an oral historian, and a curious case of post-colonial trauma. I'm quite excited to be discussing the works of one of the most iconic short story writers of partition, Sadaat Hasan Manto. In this podcast, I will be exploring Manto's Tooba Singh in particular, and his works in general as a form of disruption and as an unsilencing of the subaltern. To explore this curiosity of partition through literature and history and historiography, I have with me the fantastic scholar Dr. Zoya Samin. Zoya is an assistant professor of history in the Faculty of Arts and Science at Khan University. Zoya is a historian of gender law and empire in the 19th and 20th century South Asia. Before we take a deep dive into exploring, dissecting, and above all, digesting Manto's humanizing of violence, a conundrum in itself of the 1947 partition and its harrowing trauma on the people of the region, let me situate my argument in what I mean when I say partition of India. When we talk about the partition of India, we're talking about two partitions, one that happens in the Punjab and the other that occurs in Bengal. Both these partitions will produce their own subset of literatures. These two diverse provinces, which had mixed populations of Hindus and Muslims for Bengal, and Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs for Punjab, were moved to create a more homogeneous group on either sides of the border of what was then West and East Pakistan and the Republic of India. So, when we talk about the partition of India, which happens in 1947, in which timeline Manto is writing his stories, this is the history and geography in which we situate his work.
And with that, Zoya, I circle back to you with the idea of South Asia, partition, India, Pakistan, Sadaat Hasan Manto, the border of Punjab, 1947, the trauma of partition, and the birth of nations.
There's a version of partition which is focuses on the violence, which the literature that we're going to discuss also delves into. There's this longer idea of partition as well, because partitions are also not overnight processes, right? There's a huge mass migration. This also doesn't just happen within a year. It actually, in fact, goes on for decades beyond the event itself. So we also should think of it as a structure, I think, not simply as an event, but also a structure. We tend to think of it more as an event because we tend to focus on that moment of rupture and violence. But there's also lots of ways in which partition over the long term reshapes the subcontinent through migration, through property rights, through people leaving their homes behind, because you're seeing societies become more homogenous as well. So this would be, I would say, an introduction to partition for those who are unfamiliar with it. Of course, as you already mentioned, we're going to do a deep dive into that, particularly in the context of Punjab through the eyes of Sadaat Hasan Manto, who is, in my opinion, probably one of the greatest short story writers of the 20th century.
So I love that both of us are in agreement to the stature and persona of Manto and his words in our understanding of partition as a human experience. I think something that you bring out very beautifully is this motif of the face of refugee. So at the time of partition, the first thing that we see is this face that we had never seen before, and we're giving it a name now, and that is the name of a refugee, a person who is in search of safety. And I use the word he here very specifically, is because in our imagination of collective partition and its trauma and its violence and its displacement and dispossession of identities, we have only been focusing on the masculine. And in that motif of the masculine, there is a very beautiful rupture that Manto brings in by telling us about who else has this face embodied and has also caused trauma too. And when we look at partition and we look at the statistics on violence, it is very like quantified.
We have around 12 to 15 million people crossing the borders into India and Pakistan, and we have approximately 1.5 to 3 million people who are reported dead or missing. So when we talk about the partition of India in 1947, these are the accepted numbers that are recognized for the partition in terms of the human migration and the human loss.
So this number of 1.5 is the people who we are assuming were killed by the violence or died because of the trauma or the conditions that made it not possible for them to exist as they were crossing these borders of Punjab and of Bengal. And Manto kind of is sitting there, and his work is almost like that of a witness. And he is saying that I am seeing something totally different from what you are saying. I'm seeing this population not as a homogeneous masculine, but I'm seeing it as many different identities embodied by many different people. Some of these identities have been thrown on them. I don't know whether they actually agreed to these identities. Like in the character Tooba takes Singh, if you just start with that, we see Bisham Singh suddenly morphed from being Bisham Singh to being Tooba takes Singh. And then from Tooba takes Singh to this identification as a Sikh. Then from that identification of being Tooba takes Singh and a Sikh, he's suddenly supposed to be dispossessed of not being just Bisham Singh, but he's supposed to be dispossessed of being Tooba takes Singh, because Tooba takes Singh is in Pakistan and he is a Sikh and he has to migrate to India. And this lunatic, again, is suddenly just done with trying to process who he has to become. And within these confusions of identity, there is a moment when you almost take a backseat and you're like, come again, what is partition and what can Manto teach me about it that I did not know?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's, before we come back to Tooba Tek Singh, let's talk about, I suppose, why partition literature is actually important in the first place. So you threw out all those figures about, the quantitative scale of partition, the migration, the displacements, the deaths. It is important to bear in mind, this is the largest mass migration in history. It is a significant movement of humanity, and there's a lot of violence associated with it. In the midst of all of that, you're always trying to, I suppose, people are disappearing behind numbers, and what Manto is trying to do is actually show the face of that experience through individual stories as well. One reason why literature becomes important, because you might ask, why are we talking about literature rather than, talking about other types of documents, other types of primary sources? The violence exists at such a scale that is unspeakable. This often happens in moments of mass violence. People can't speak what they've witnessed, what they've experienced, what they know. There are decades of silence that follow incidents like this. Similarly, something similar happens with the Holocaust as well, which is why oral histories then end up becoming important, and literature ends up becoming important, because at some point, people will want to speak about what happened, but it's often decades after the event. Literature is a bit closer to the event because people are using the genre of fiction, the genre of the novel, the short story, to express something through this protection of fiction almost, right? To express what they're seeing. And so that's why actually it's much more interesting to read the literature instead of talking about the high politics of partition, right? What so-and-so politician was saying. And in fact, Tooba Tek Singh actually writes that into the story itself, right? The dissonance between the high politics and the everyday experience. And so that brings us to Manto, who I think there's a tragedy of partition that he's seeing, right? Everyone's seeing it. I think he's experiencing it so viscerally because he's from, he thinks of Bombay as home. He doesn't really want to leave India, but he is seeing in front of him societies change in ways that, he couldn't have anticipated. The category Muslim, Hindu, Sikh becoming more prominent than perhaps earlier in his life. All of a sudden he has to deal with, this aspect of his identity. So lots of things are being thrust onto people that they don't necessarily find agreeable, right? And that's something that's happening to Bisham Singh in the context of Tooba Tek Singh. And another important thing to note is that actually this story was written, it's one of his last stories. It's part of his last collection of essays that's published in 1955, which is also the year of his death. And his own psychological trauma, his own psychological experiences are also, I think, expressed through the protagonist of Tooba Singh. So I suppose we can just dive into the story from there. So do you want to sort of talk about how it makes you feel about as a way to understand partition history?
So for me, I think the fact that his closing is so poignant, that he is suddenly a person who never bent, is fallen, and all he sees are these barbed wires. And he himself is questioning, then who am I? If I don't identify as an Indian, and I don't identify as a Pakistani, and I want to identify as a South Asian, then where do I go? Because like this motif again of, and it's almost an unraveling where you see people post 1947. And Manto talks about that, like his last collection of work is where we find this trauma of partition actually manifesting itself in his memories, in his writing, in his works. And he has this quest where he's trying to actually unpack it. And he's trying to unpack it by creating these characters, which he believes humanizes what it means to be South Asian. And he's trying to constantly tell himself that, yes, these partitions, these national identities have been thrust upon these populations, but it is a temporary event. And just like, things that have happened before, it's going to pass. Going back to identity and how identification of two specific subaltern groups is suddenly emerging is this idea of people who don't have agency to decide where they go, how they go, and the state suddenly being in a position to dictate where they will is what you see. So for him, what we see in the face of Tooba Singh is the madness of partition, the thrust of identification, and a confusion of the self. I mean, there are these three very specific: identity, self, and nation. These three themes, at least for me, that's what they were evolving. And there is an individual, just one, who's refusing to adhere to those identifications, even if it means that he becomes what I would then say a refugee, or the classic face of a refugee for 1947.
Yeah. So just the first line that you referred to, in which, so it's a few years after partition. That's the interesting part. It's not, we're beyond that moment, right? So some formation of nation being has occurred, but amidst all of that, there is still Bishan Singh, who does not fall into either model of nation being. But the interesting point is, when I teach Tooba Singh, so I've taught it to students in the US and now in Pakistan, I always ask, why do you think he chooses lunatics? Why is he choosing a lunatic asylum? Because they cannot put a rational lens on it, right? And so through them, the chaos, the irrationality of just exchanging human beings across a border becomes even more foregrounded. So it's also a very strategic choice. It's also satirical, right? Well, we're exchanging our prisoners, we're exchanging women, we're exchanging weapons, utensils. Why not exchange lunatics as well? So it's meant to be a commentary in that regard as well. But I always find the space of the asylum quite interesting, and how the asylum residents try to reason through what's happening around them. So even the question of what is Pakistan, Bishan Singh is engaging with that, but there are also a lot of the other residents are trying to address this question. The answers are very intentionally as a place where cutthroat readers are made, because no one knows. Even the people who perhaps are the architects of Pakistan cannot actually, with any clarity, tell you what Pakistan is. And through the perspective of one of these residents, he's able to actually get to that exchange of human beings at the border. There are actual exchanges happening. So it's not, he's actually building on something that's actually happening, but perhaps exaggerating it to its limits to make a point about the reality. So you have prisoners that actually prisoners are going to Pakistan, and prisoners are going from Pakistan to India. The other thing that I think is relevant to note is that there's a lot of abduction of women that's happening at the point of partition, and this is also where the gendered also come in, because you've got around 100,000 women that are abducted by men who belong to communities that are not their own. So this is an act of intercommunal violence between Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim communities. And so when these women are recovered, and all of them actually don't want to return, by the way, because some of them feel so much shame of what they would be subjected to if they did return. But there actually are recovery operations where women are then taken to the border, very similar to the barbed wire space that Bishan Singh collapses in, and actually are exchanged, right? You actually have the Indian side saying, give us our Hindu women back. You have the Pakistan side saying, give us our Muslim women back. The exchange of lunatics is a commentary on all these other types of exchanges that are actually happening as well. It's just so deliberately exaggerated to just make the point of how ridiculous it is to exchange human beings on the basis of religious categories. So that's always the history around Tooba Singh always interests me as well. But going back to what you're saying about identity, self, and nation, I think these are three really good categories to work with in terms of understanding the story. Belonging, we can also throw that in, which kind of is trying to, there's a sense in which that's the sense that marries all of these categories that you raise. I always ask students, what is Tooba Singh? And everyone comes up with a different answer because there isn't a definitive answer of what Tooba Singh is. So it actually, literally, it is actually a tehsil in Punjab, which is now actually in Pakistan. That is where the character Bishan Singh is actually from. It has nothing to do with that particular district, though. The purpose is the scale of locality, right? For Bishan Singh, it doesn't matter whether he belongs to a nation, and locality matters to him. And so it's also a commentary on partition in terms of thrusting nationhood or the nation form onto people for whom the scale of locality, the unit of locality, carries far more meaning. And so there's that sense that Tooba Singh is a home that can never be home again because now it has been thrust into a nation state to which Bishan Singh no longer belongs, right? So it's the loss of locality, the loss of that type of belonging and the inability to belong in a different way. Now Tooba Singh, because that is the only place where Bishan Singh can find some semblance of belonging, is Tooba Singh Bishan Singh himself. There's so many interpretations. And so just sitting with the question, what is Tooba Singh, and trying to address that, I think opens up so many possibilities for understanding the elimination of these various forms of belonging that partition does take away, right? And while it does create these new forms of belonging through the nation state, those are not forms of belonging that everyone agrees with. Those are not forms of belonging that actually apply to people like Bishan Singh or the other residents of the asylum. So I think that's also a question to stay with. What actually is Tooba Singh? And yeah, I think it's always open to interpretation. I think Tooba Singh representing some kind of belonging that no longer is always somewhere where I land on with my students, but obviously also keen to hear your thoughts.
So for me, Tooba Singh is like in the curiosity of identity and formations of nations and states, he is a no man land. He is an anomaly because, and that is the anomaly that I feel Manto was also struggling with. And he is trying to push his own thoughts into trying to identify. And he did. Like, we know that when he comes to Pakistan in 1948, he's writing and trying to convince his very dear friend Ismat Chughtai to come. And he writes to her in one of the letters and he says that, you should come, just you and me, we're going to take over Pakistan and Lahore, and we're going to be the most important literary figures there. And she refuses, and he kind of writes back to her in a very sharp way, and they kind of stop talking to each other for some time because he thinks that she is not willing to go. And I oftentimes have felt, and maybe it's just me, that every time I read Manto, I feel that remorse that he feels with himself, and like he feels this disdain for himself for having chosen to come to Pakistan because he felt that it would be safe for him. We know that he takes the decision to migrate. He doesn't want to leave Bombay. He believes that he is Bombay, and Bollywood is him. That is where he's felt most happy, most appreciated and accepted. He hasn't felt that anywhere else. He hasn't felt that as a child. He hasn't felt that as a person writing initially. It is only when he comes to Bombay that we feel or we find that he's actually found some semblance of happiness. That's the only time. And he's having a conversation with his friend Shyam, and he says that, this person has been killed, and how do you feel about that? And his friend says that, I would kill you if that was me. And that kind of jolts him, and he's like, oh my God, I'm not safe here. This is my friend. And my friend is saying that he would kill me, so I can't stay here. So he wraps up and hops on to Pakistan, thinking that once he has reached Pakistan, he will be safe. So this idea of safety is what propelled the movement. But then the question becomes, what propelled the idea of unsafety? Like, I don't know. I know everything does not need to exist in binaries, but in this particular context, it's really important to question not what feeling safe was about, but what feeling unsafe was about. So a lot of movement was not because this idea of a new nation was something that was propelling people to move across borders and start these new lives, get absorbed in these cultures which were not theirs, to be very honest, But this false identity formation that promised safety is what made the movement. So in a lot of Manto's writing, especially when I read and reread Tooba Takes Singh, this is something that keeps staring back at me. That I left India because I felt unsafe. Yet I don't feel safe here because I don't belong.
Yeah.
And we know that he is he's put in jail many times. There are many cases that are put up on him for being extremely vulgar, not conforming to the idea of the culture of Pakistan, its moral, ethical boundaries of being a Muslim nation. Yet he kind of is pushing and saying, but I am all of that. But this is what is happening. I mean, denying me to be a witness to what I observe is denying that it has happened or is happening. And he pushes that continuously. And for me, like, Tooba Takes Singh is also the madness of partition that no one talks about. Like, we never discuss what is the trauma of it, because we never made as a nation to accept it as traumatic. In the idea of modern nation states, the birth of Pakistan is pure. It's like purity in all itself. Pakistan, Pak, pure, right? This idea of purity cannot be accompanied by the idea of the impurity of blood. So this complete separation of the idea of partition from independence of Pakistan is one of the biggest traumas of our times, and something that is so traumatic that we can't even talk about it. We don't have the language for it. We don't have the words for it. And then we have someone like Manto who's trying.
Yeah. So with I suppose it's helpful to also note that for Pakistan and also now for Bangladesh, partition is written into our origin stories of nationhood. So we all have to contend with it because it is the condition for the existence of what is then West and East Pakistan and now Bangladesh, right? There is a partitioning of the land of the Indian subcontinent to create states. In India, it's a bit more diverse because across, of course, in Punjab, of course, in North India, there is this memory and this resonance of partition. In Bengal and East India as well. In South India, actually, it's not really as present. It's not something that really shapes their identities because there isn't there is no proximate partitioning. I suppose Hyderabad is another case because of its Muslim majority population, but generally it's not something that features. So the South Asians who share partition in terms of this trauma, in terms of this inability to speak about something that's unspeakable, it is the northern belt of what we can call the South Asian subcontinent now, right? So Pakistan, parts of North India, East India, and Bangladesh. And so it's interesting because one of the ways in which South Asians talk about partition other than literature is also film. Now, Manto is saying lots of things without saying them. That's not just in Tooba Take Singh, but in all of his stories. He's trying all these things that you and I are extrapolating are things that are unsaid on the paper, but because the subtleties and the silences speak so loudly, that's what we're getting out of it. But even through film, we talk about, for instance, the lost and found genre, right? The genres of people who were separated at birth and they find each other. That's a way of talking about partition without talking about partition, right? The sense that something has been broken off from you that is in fact a part of you and your life is in search of that something, right? So there are all these ways in which we end up talking about partition through these mediums of literature, film, and so on, because of the heaviness of the trauma, because of that violence. And so now returning to another point you made about how Tooba Take Singh in particular, and Tooba Take Singh, I think you and I are in agreement about this, is perhaps the partition story to rule all the other partition stories. I think there is more consensus around Tooba Take Singh than any other story in this regard because of how effectively it is able to leave its reader with this sense of confusion that people had at the time. The fact that in 2024, after reading that last sentence, you will be left with the same confusion that Bishan Singh would have had years after partition, that someone else might have had in 47 as well, right? So there's something just so urgent and immediate and also timeless about it that I think it just carries that status in partition folklore. But this dissonance, so the fact that we don't talk about the violence of partition, it has to be some kind of victory narrative because it, there's independence. And that's true across, I would say that's true on both sides of the border. For instance, if you look at Jawaharlal Nehru's midnight, the famous speech that he makes at the dawn of independence, while the world sleeps, India will wake to life and freedom. And, the headlines that are appearing on Dawn News in Pakistan and so on, the fact that accompanying all of these claims of victory, independence, and just the justice of, waking up into nationhood, the fact that what's accompanying all of this is mass violence, gendered violence, sexual violence, killings, displacement, family breakups. It's the condition for nationhood is also traumatic. It is, in fact, arguably more traumatic than it is joyful for lots of South Asians. And it is true that if we don't read partition literature, we don't have access to that perspective. So this is something that students also, the students I just taught this story to in these past few months, they said the exact same thing to me. We only hear about the high politics. We only hear about Jinnah. We only hear about Liaquat Ali Khan. We hear about Gandhi, Nehru. We don't actually hear about what people went through. We don't hear about the violence. We don't hear about the displacement. We don't, because of course, all of these things cast confusion around the nation form, right? The purpose is to try and bring some clarity around the nation form as the, as the ultimate way of organizing society. And you have stories like Tooba Take Singh that call that the entire foundations of that thinking into question. I think this dissonance is something we can speak about and also speak about how it exists in Tooba Take Singh. For instance, there's the moment in the story where Jinnah's messages are coming through the radio or something. The way in which people understand Jinnah, they don't quite know who he is, they don't quite know what he represents, but there's some vagueness around, there's some vague understanding of his importance. But I think the such purposeful way in which Manto makes someone who has been given such centrality in the ideological imagining of Pakistan, such irrelevance in this story about belonging, is so impactful because it perhaps reflects something truer to the time, right? In the midst of all these exchanges, these migrations, these acts of violence, good grief, why would you be thinking about the high politics? Why would you be thinking about the leaders and these imaginings that are more joyful, enthusiastic, and victorious? There's something traumatic that's unfolding in front of your eyes, right? And so there is a silencing around this violence because you can't really have a liberatory national origin story, with it, right? Because you have to then acknowledge that actually there's trauma that that shapes the early years of Pakistan, and not the early years. I mean, it's intergenerational, right? It still shapes us. So that dissonance, I think, is something that we do need to talk about. We do need to address why it's only when kids come to college that they realize, oh, okay, partition isn't this. It's actually quite a tragic and sad story, right? And it's a structure that shapes South Asia till this day. Just another quick point about the safety, unsafety categories that you were raising. Karachi, the city that you're in, the city that I live in, it is a significant Hindu city prior to partition. You have an exodus of Hindus from Karachi, and you have a cleansing of Karachi of its Hindu past. Places like Arambagh were actually once called Rambagh, and there's just so many examples of these ways in which Karachi has been cleansed of that plural past that it had. There was such an uncertainty around what was happening. Of course, people were fearful. So it's not that all these Hindus left Karachi for India. Why would you leave your property, your businesses, your family, your history? Why would you leave so readily? It's this fear, this uncertainty, this sense that, okay, let's just go for a few months, let's go for a year, wait until things settle down, and then we'll return. Unfortunately, once they leave, people take over their homes that are emptied. They're not allowed to come back because then we come up with this thing called the Citizenship Act of 1951, where Hindus who leave past a certain date cannot claim the right to being a Pakistani citizen, even though they were born in what then is Pakistan. So there are all these ways in which homogeneity cleansing is actually curated. It doesn't just happen. It's actually curated. So even the sense of feeling unsafe, while there may be some uncertainty that's shaping that, the feeling of being unsafe is also curated from above. It's not something that just rises up organically either. Absolutely something that Manto experiences, but it's also something that people are made to experience in order to create the conditions to shape the societies that we are now part of.
I mean, I love this point of yours. I mean, love it. So picking on that, I want to go dive a little deeper into this idea of citizen and this idea of citizenship and this involvement of who you claim yourself to be. Again, when we look at partition as a movement and we look at partition as a displacement of people, we are thinking of it in terms of almost like, when I would imagine it, I would look at it as a jigsaw puzzle. And then pieces are picked up and put in where they belong. This idea of being in a space where you belong is highly problematic, especially for a region as multicultural, diverse, multilinguistic, multi-religious as South Asia, where these forced identities created a rupture within the individuals, created a rupture within a social fabric, which has yet not been sewn back because this rupture has never been accepted as something that actually happened. So this idea of citizenship and who belongs where, the 1951 act of citizenship that both India and Pakistan agree to. I mean, Nehru and Liaquat sign a deal on it. And very conveniently, high politics also decides what happens to the land that now suddenly is part of the state of origin of either India or Pakistan. And this kind of creates these layers, which Manto is trying to unpack when he talks about people's movement. He keeps on referring back and forth. Even in Tooba Takes Singh, he is questioning the movement of people, and especially certain people who we want to identify as humans, but we don't. Like, for example, when he talks about the lunatics, he's like, oh, it has been decided by a few important people that these people will be moved, yet they are being moved like objects. As a South Asian Muslim woman, I don't think I struggle as much as just going where he wants me to go. Like, I'm willing to become Tooba Takes Singh for him when I'm reading this. And I don't have any issues with where he wants to lead me. I actually am able to become his thought when I'm reading. And here I don't feel any disruption or any dissatisfaction with how he wants me to see things. But when, like you said, when he's talking about Sakina, or when he's talking about Roselle, or when he's talking about, anybody else, I do question his voice for me. I'm like, I love the fact that you want to unsilence me, but don't patronize me while unsilencing me. So that idea of patronizing feminine within a South Asian imagination is a continuous motif. And that is something that I also see in Manto's work. And although I love the fact that he has, within his literary work, created that discourse to occur, but I do believe that it is for us as scholars, us as people who engage with this work on question, and to let it naturally evolve into a body of work which carries trauma, and it carries trauma on the body of the feminine as a representation of a structure of patriarchy that was falling apart in Asia in 1947. I mean, that is exactly Asian Manto's work for me as a feminine in South Asia, as identifying as it, and so as a last closing, if I were to ask your favorite part about Tooba Takes Singh, and we can close on that.
So I would always recommend reading Manto in Urdu. Reading that story in Urdu for the first time, I think particularly that last sentence, it goes something like idhar khada taron ke piche Hindustan tha wahan Pakistan tha aur beech mein jis tukre ka koi naam nahi tha wahan raha Tooba Takes Singh, something like this. It's just the way it hits you. You do have to ask yourself, why is this particular line hitting me in the way it is? And I still don't have a clear-cut answer to that. I don't think anyone does, because it's something that's so, I'll use the word again, it's so viscerally felt. There is no reason behind it. So I think in terms of my favorite part of the story, I think I'll take that as moving. The part that will always move me most is precisely the ending. And again, just, Bishan Singh doesn't feel safe that he's being transported across the Baga border. If anything, it makes him feel unsafe that he's going to India. Safety is the idea of Tooba Takes Singh, his home, his locality. So I mean, all the levels that Tooba Takes Singh is working on. It's the land that has no name between India and Pakistan. It's the actual district in Punjab that Bishan Singh calls home. It's what people call Bishan Singh because he's become indistinguishable from the belonging that he's searching for. All those things just kind of collapse into one feeling, one expression in that final sentence. And you're left wondering, you are left wondering, what is Pakistan? What is India? What is South Asia? The edifice of what you might think belonging is called into question through that last line. So I would say that that's the most moving part.
That was a beautiful closing, Zoya. What can one say? I mean, I think that is the question that we're all left with, that what is India, what is Pakistan, and what is belonging? And in its South Asian imagination, I think that question becomes more relevant today than ever before. And to be able to have the works of Manto in order to not just grapple with these realities, but also to try and find meaning within these experiences it becomes even more important. He humanizes the partition, but while humanizing it, he also leaves us with the trauma, which is a continuous process and will remain so. And it is important for us to accept that, to understand that, and try and always engage with it. So thank you for this conversation, and thank you for discussing Manto and Tooba Singh with me.